So this video is about how I made a perfectly normal Bowie knife. Hey guys, so I made a Bowie knife. Totally normal Bowie knife, normal thing for me to make. I don't normally make fixed blade knives, let alone really big fixed blade knives like Bowie knives. In modern day world, Bowie knives are just not practical, and I like making practical knives. But when the Sam Towns, Big Fudge, the Fudgerigar himself, put out a global competition to knife makers everywhere to make a Bowie knife, I had to join in, because it wasn't just to make any Bowie knife, it was to make a Bowie knife that met certain dimensions and specifications. It had to have certain features, and also the aim of it was not necessarily to make the most ornate Bowie knife or the fanciest Bowie knife or the most expensive in materials Bowie knife or anything like that. It was to make the Bowie knife that most impressed the Fudgerigar. Now, Sam loves Bowie knives. They are his jam. They're his bread and butter. The bigger the better, because he's a big fella like me, and he likes big knives. So I had to get on board with this. But to be honest, I didn't think I was going to make it. Shortly after starting it, some shit went down and I got ill and I was running out of time, and my plan had been pretty ambitious. Now, if you don't already listen to the ForgeCast that I co-host, definitely check that out. The link's in the description. It's a podcast about bladesmithing and blacksmithing, and on there I've been talking up some pretty hefty game about how I'm going to win the competition. And the reason I want to win is because my wife has been getting into making knives. She's getting damn good at it, but she really wants to get into engraving. And I could make her an engraving set, but I really like Sam's engraving tools. I actually have some of Sam's engraving tools, and the first prize is an engraving set. All the other prizes, 6 prizes in total, and all of them are great, but that one I had my eye on, so I thought, well, if I'm going to win this, it has to be an impressive knife, because there are some great and talented people out there, as you will see when the results start spreading around of this. But also, Sam's my mate. Like, we are famously good friends, and we co-host a podcast together. So if I won, in order to avoid claims of nepotism, I would have to make something so impressive that people would be like, yeah, he won. I don't know if I'll win. As I'm recording this, I haven't seen the results because it's not yet midnight on December 31st. So I don't know if I'm going to win. I wanted to give it my damnedest. I wanted to do my absolute best. And my absolute best has been getting bigger over the last year. So I thought, why not wrap out the year of knife making for me, because this is the year where it all clicked with me and my knife making careers took off and my knives started becoming desirable by people, which is really awesome, and I've been able to make my living off of it, which is really awesome. So why not finish out the year that did it all for me, where it all happened, with something redonkulous. So let's lower you down and I'll show you what I built. Okay, so here's the knife I made. Looks like a nice clean design, doesn't it? It's a clean Bowie knife. It's a couple of slightly odd features, but it's got the nice clip point, nice heel there, guard, a little sub hilt there, just because I can. It's even got some nice filed spine work and such, just to make it a little bit more ornate. But the real secret to this knife comes when you flip it over and see it from the other side. That's right, now it starts looking like a Mauser or something. And this is where the secret of this knife comes into play. Like I said, I don't really do fixed blade knives. So when Sam put out a challenge to make a Bowie knife, I thought, well, it's got to be a folder. I've got to make a Bowie folder. It's how I roll. This is how I schwang it. So this is what I made. This monster is actually a functional folding knife. And you can see, got some nice filed spine work there. On the inside, there's some nice filed spine work. Got a nice sub hilt here. And this flappy thing here, which clicks into two positions. There's an upward position where it stops there, and a downward position where it goes flush enough that when you're holding it, it rests inside your thumb very, very cleanly, and gives you a very comfortable grip with that sub hilt holding the finger in place. The handle is beautiful bull oak from Australia, which is actually the hardest wood in the world. And I chose that because, as you can see, there's a lot going on in terms of holes and depressions and things like that, and I wanted it to be super stable. And this is actually stabilized wood by Ryan at Otway Fiddleback, and it's one of his favorites, and I can see why. But I know you're all waiting to see how this actually works. In order to fold this closed, you lift up this, and you grab your sub hilt, and you pull on it. And all of a sudden, this starts pivoting out. And then it locks into place like that. And when you push on this lever, it lifts a locking latch up that's under spring tension, which allows you to release the blade, and the guard folds with it. Down it goes, and it sits snug inside of that fold-out guard there, which means you can't accidentally stab yourself, which is really quite nice. So once it all locks together, it's quite a cozy little package, and it locks closed as well. So in order to open it, you have to flick this up, release the lock, open it up, and get the lock out of the way. I'm just doing it slow so you can see it, and then it locks into place, and the guard folds away inside the handle, and you've got this here. And I will say, when it's actually in the folded closed state, it's got a lovely line of filed spine work. You get to sort of see it all in its glory. But that's what I made. That's my entry. And yes, it meets all of the parameters. The cutting edge is 20 centimeters long. The handle is longer than it needs to be to meet the requirements, but long enough to actually fit the whole thing in. It's got a false edge on the back with a clip, and it was difficult to build. Let me tell you, this is difficult to put together. Even you can see here all of the pieces that are involved in actually putting this thing together. And yeah, it is a process to get this thing together. And I've had to pull it apart and put it back together so many times during the build of this to get it done. But yeah, what a beast. It's heavy for a Bowie knife, but it's actually balanced pretty well. I'm going to see if I can get this fully in camera. It's balanced right where your index finger sits, and so when you're holding it, maybe just below where your index finger sits, so when you're holding it, it feels super light, super light. Now you may think this is super cool and want it, and don't worry, this will actually go up for sale, but I have to do a disclaimer. Bowie knives are designed for pretty hard work. Like, they are a big boy chopper knife, and they usually have very thick spines, and they are designed to withstand some intense work. This, while looking like a Bowie, is still a folding knife, and it is not designed for that much hard work. While it is a perfectly functional knife and quite tough, it would not handle chopping through a 2x4 like a Bowie could. No folding knife could. I know there's a lot of manufacturers out there that claim to do it, like I've seen some pretty amazing claims of some of Cold Steel's folding knives and that, but this is just a latch lock folder and should be treated as such. It is not durable enough to deal with that kind of torture. So this is a showpiece knife. It totally works. I would never daily carry this because, let me tell you, I am someone who owns a Cold Steel Rajah 2, and yes, I did daily carry that for a while, and this is even bigger than that, by a considerable margin. But yeah, I'm really happy with how it came out. So yeah, I hope Sam likes it, because there are a lot of subtleties and details and things that actually make this possible. I was heavily inspired to make this by two things, actually. One, there is an old patent from about 1918 for a folding Bowie knife that you wouldn't think it'd be that old, but it is over 100 years old, this design. At least, I mean, that's just when the patent was. Because sometimes you only have the room to carry one knife and you want to be able to carry two types, and one of the hallmarks of that is that when you are holding it while it's closed, a short amount of blade sticks out the top, so you've got a small knife, and then you can fold that open and have a larger knife. Not practical. It was somebody's idea of a clever design, but in reality it's not a particularly clever design. But then I saw a incredible piece of work, which I actually used as my inspiration of the week on the ForgeCast once, by a mysterious bladesmith called Chase Sun, I believe it's pronounced, and he calls himself the slave of the blade, and he makes exquisite work. And he made this folding sub-hilt knife. It is considerably smaller than what I've just done, but the mechanism is more or less the same. His is obviously done a lot more elegantly than mine. But I'll tell you what, given that I did this in about a week, I'm pretty happy with that. It's haven't decided on a name for it yet. If you think of one, leave it down in the comments. But yeah, it still has a couple of finishing touches I'd like to do on it before I sell it, just to make it as nice for the end owner as possible. There's as with all projects, there are a few things that I would like to change, but by and large, I'm very happy with it. I think it's one of the coolest things I've ever made, even though it is ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. Just don't mistake me on that. So let's go through the process, because one of the things that Sam requires for entry is actually showing the process of making it. So I'll walk you through it. So first up, cut out roughly the blade. I did the design first in CAD on my computer, so I had a vague idea of what it was going to be like. But whenever you've got interacting mechanisms like this, you can only really get sort of close. The rest of it's got to be done manually, so I was able to pinpoint holes and rough shape it using stock removal. Then I made up some scales that looked a bit like boots, but they were kind of just a rough shape. And I got a sense of how long the stick out of the blade was going to be, which was going to help determine the guard. And at this point, I could sort of start seeing how ridiculously big this knife was going to be. But the guard had to take precedence, because everything sort of centers around that cantilevered pivot of a guard, and the blade had to be able to pass through the middle of it, so it was split. Had a pinhole going through it, and then was split down the middle, and all of this had to have very tight tolerances to allow freedom of movement, but not to allow rattle, especially not scuffing up the blade. So yeah, this was roughed in at this point, and still given the kind of I wanted it to have that S profile. Didn't quite have it here, but it was on its way. You see later how that comes together. And then I got to actually sort of see it open, and at this point the guard stopped the blade from opening any further. It was a bit sticky at first. Clever rounding managed to get rid of that, but seeing it all start to come together, I was starting to get more of a sense of what it was going to be like in the hand. But with no bevels on it, it was very, very heavy at this point. And you can see that the pivot pin is quite small here. Originally it was just a 4mm pivot pin, which I decided was not big enough, and I actually doubled up on it. The final one has an 8mm pivot pin. But yeah, it was starting to have a bit of an action, and here you can see there's the spacer in the back. you can see the bolts holding it in place, and that space has started dictating the lock-up feel of everything, which was quite nice to actually see. And I sort of put out a tantalizing sneak peek to a few people on social media to show that, yes, indeed, I am working on a knife, but this is pretty much where work stopped after I got ill. So it just sat in this state for weeks. But then I picked it up again and started working on things like where the latch mechanism is going to be. So I had to punch some holes in there. You can see I've upgraded the pivot pin size, made the latch, and that had to be heat treated and then ground into a spring profile. So many tapped holes in this, it just drove me nuts. And believe it or not, despite using 3mm taps or M3 taps, I didn't break a single one for the entire project. But boy, there were some nerve-wracking moments. But being able to put the actual latch lock in place was pretty cool. I don't have a milling machine yet, so making all these parts by hand was a bit of a nightmare. But I had to, in order to get the leverage to lift the latch up to actually release the knife, I drilled a hole in a piece of flat bar and used the corner of it to lever the thing up. And that was actually how it worked for quite some time. But eventually I got it a nice snappy lockup, which you can see here when everything falls into place. And boy, that's a good feeling when you've been sitting there working on it for that long. And then I finally made the first version of the thumb latch, which actually creates the leverage to release the blade. I ended up having to make a new one in the end because it didn't give quite enough lift for my purposes, and it kept interrupting the guard, which was not good. But yeah, now it was actually starting to look like a knife, and I started profiling in the false edge along the back, along the clip, and centering my bevel lines, and everything was going good. But then I realized I had stuffed up the actual mechanism point, removed a little bit too much, and you can't add steel back, so I had to make a new blade from the ground up, which was a bit of a pain. But here I started making the stainless sleeve, sort of bolster sleeve that holds the latch in place and stops, errant fingers or skin getting caught in there, because there is quite a bit of force on that spring. And so, safety comes first. But here you can see just how much lift is all it takes. And that's still the old cantilever, but it bends that spring up quite well. Like, you can't do that with your fingers, but that cantilever makes it a very easy process to do. Making these tiny pieces by hand really proved challenging throughout the entire build, but I'm happy with how they came out. So here it was sort of together, really. You still didn't have the swing out guard, but the entire blade mechanism was working. You could press the lock closed, you could press the button, release the blade, swing it all the way into the open position, and then lock it closed again and get a nice satisfying snap on the latch. And that felt really good. And here you can see this is the new cantilever, which is the one that's on there now. So yeah, locks open and locks closed, both very satisfying. So everything was starting to come together, looking nice and clean, and I had to work on the guard because I can't just have a blade poking out the bottom. That's not very safe at all. At this point, I'd ground the bevels on the new blade, and it was the lightness that it gave the knife was phenomenal. Didn't realize how front heavy it was, because there's a lot of steel in a 20mm cutting edge. But here I liked how it just sort of sat. You can see the kick-out sub-hilt very heavily influenced by Chase One's work. But yeah, it felt really nice in the hand, even without any scales on there. So at this point, I started getting an idea of how big my scales are going to have to be. And in the end, the scales are only about 4 or 5 millimeters thick, so it's not too bad, really. But yeah, it started feeling really nice in the hand. Did a lot of walking around carrying it just for the sake of it, because it felt nice to carry and just play with the mechanism. But having everything starting to get locked up was exciting to actually see it come together. So I started analyzing the open and close to make sure that it was smooth, make sure that it went well every time. Couple of small alignment issues that had to be ironed out. It's a big project. The distance that the tip travels from the open position to the closed position is huge. It's 40 centimeters. I mean, think about that for a minute. It is traveling nearly half a meter from the open position to the closed position, and to get that tip to actually line up where you want it to be after that much travel is tricky when you've only got one pivot point. So 1 degree of offset is enough to completely throw a mechanism. So filed spine work on everything, you know, my style, and this was no exception. Despite the time constraints, I knew I had to do something to make it fancy. But when you combine it all together, especially in the closed position, you see that beautiful flow as it runs down, and it's really quite cool. I was going to do one flowing design, but ended up having to change it because it's got so many bolts running through it with threaded holes that I risked the filed spine work cutting into where those holes are, so it had to be interrupted at spaces, which kind of gave it a cool, unique look, which I'm quite happy with in the end. But then I finally managed to start hand sanding on the blade, the new fixed blade, and it started coming together quite nice. I didn't end up going with a super high finish on it just because time constraints. I know Sam likes a really high polish, but you know, that takes a lot of time I don't have for this build. But yeah, finally it was essentially a working knife. It just didn't have handle scales, didn't have pants. So it had to, I had to put it down for the day, and I had 1 day left at this point to do all of the handle scale work, everything, and then all of the finishing work on all of the pieces. So at this point, it was totally functional, just ugly, essentially. So from this point, I had to start finishing the small pieces and then riveting them together. These are all hand riveted with stainless steel pins. In order to, that's very nerve-wracking too, because one errant blow and you can make that rivet too tight, and there's not much you can do at that point. But they all are freely moving. And then I worked on the guard to get that S shape that is very quintessential to Bowie knives, and I know Sam likes it. Did a bit of faceting work with different grit levels on the different facets, just to give it a little bit of an eye-catching aesthetic. Particularly like how that came out. And then hand sanding the blade more. And the clip is actually twice the grit of the blade, just to give it, once again, a little bit more facet work. And they look great together, to be honest. I was quite happy with them. Then, of course, all of the detail work on the filed spine work pieces, because they had been rough carved in but needed quite a bit of TLC to clean them up. And then finally the whole thing started coming together looking nice and fancy, and with those parts being cleaned up, all I had left to do was to work on the scales. So one side is completely wood because there's no mechanism on that side, and the other side is half and half with stainless steel. So in order to make it be able to reliably go together again, because it's such a complex assembly, it has all these hidden alignment pins inside of it, which, because I mean, you drill an 1/8 inch hole for an 1/8 inch screw, but the threaded part of the screw is actually slightly smaller than 1/8 inch, so it allows for wobble. So you need to have at least 2 alignment pins in there in order to make it sit in the same place every time, and that They can be fiddly to keep a track of. But at this point, the handle was starting to come together. It looked ugly, it looked rough, but it was coming together. And the stainless piece, I think, looks quite good. But you can see how many pieces are starting to build up in this assembly. I was starting to have to come up with systems to keep track of them all. So the first thing that needed shaping up and fixing was the stainless steel bolster, because just having a raw bit of stainless steel stained with blue Dicam was not good enough. So I had to do a bit of shaping, bit of smoothing, and sort of hint at a finger well, indexing well on one side, even though there was sort of an empty space above it. But it started coming together and started looking more and more like a handle. opted for an heirloom fit between the wooden scales and the stainless, and that bull oak is just a phenomenal wood. It's just stunning. And I was really hanging out to get some oil on that and see how it would look, and I was not let down. And this is where it really started making me get excited, because it really started looking like a real knife at this point. That I knew I still had the other side to go, so off I went and started work on that. This side was a little bit easier. We were just profiling it, get all of the screws that hold it down in place, make sure everything's aligned correctly, and then polish, oil, and off it went. So then it was just final details, just little details, little roundovers on, as you can see here, there's some sharp corners and things still they needed dealing with, and yeah, it's those little tiny details that really make something spectacular at the end. But together, when it was all finished, it was really looking like a great piece. And I was really just dying to put it all together and see how it would look, to be honest. And so here it is together. At this point, there was not much left to do, only a couple of small things. And so I basically sort of sat with it for a while, opened it, closed it, played with it, looked at it, and tried to see where's it loose, where's it hanging up, where a scratch is forming, what could be done to make it better with the amount of time that I have left. But closed, it looked great. Unfortunately, I was unable to stop it scuffing on the sides of the guard. I managed to minimize it quite a bit. I found a few places it was rubbing, but it's just it's a friction fit, and that's what happens on friction fits. But in its open state, it's got a really nice line to it, a really lovely silhouette. What I wanted was, even though it is a novelty piece, essentially, I wanted it to still look like a nice, classy Bowie knife at the end of it when it's open, and I really think I got that. Here you can see just how many pieces. This is a full disassembly of the pieces. Even with this, though, there are still, you can see the guard is riveted attached to the blade, and the two pieces of the latch lock are riveted together. But still, there's a lot of pieces in this project. Also, that fold-out guard is actually 3 pieces, but once again riveted together. Then had to electro-etch my touch mark on there, which, using my homemade electro-etcher, was a very easy process. And that was it. I mean, that's usually the last step on a knife for me, at least in my process. And it came out lovely. I was really quite happy with it. It looks great. It feels wonderful to hold. It's nicely balanced. Meets all of the requirements that Sam set. So I threw an edge on there, and she's sharp. So yeah, sorry for the simple video, but it is the evening of the last day of 2021, and I have been working my tushy off to get this thing finished in time and this video done, and then once this is done, I've got to go edit it and upload it with Australian internet, so hopefully I get it all done in time. But thank you so much for stopping by to see my freakish creation, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it, because it's pretty cool. I don't think I will ever make something as ridiculous as this again. Although I like the idea of the folding Bowie, sort of, larger than it should be folding knife. I don't think I'd do it this big, but probably closer to the 1918 patent style. So hope you enjoyed it, and check out all my links below. Big thank you to my patrons who have actually basically supplemented my income while I've been making this instead of working. But yeah, as always, if you want one of my knives, I have a process, because I make sort of one-of-a-kind knives to keep it fair. I have a system, so if you would like one of my knives, check this video. It explains the system, and that goes for this knife as well. It'll probably be maybe a week or 2 before it goes up for sale, as of releasing this video. Maybe sooner, who knows. I'm going to have a bit of a rest, because I didn't really rest the last week or so, we'll see. But thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you on the next video. Bye.